Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Human Biology, Chapter 4, Part 2. And previously, in Part 1, we started talking about tissues, glands, and membranes. We learned about what happened with Ben. We learned what tissues were. We learned the 4 types of tissue: muscle, nervous, epithelial, and connective. We learned about muscle tissue first and the 3 types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Then we learned about nervous tissue and that it communicates with nerve impulses, and that a basic nerve cell is a neuron, and neuroglial are the supporting cells. And then we learned about epithelial tissue, and those are often formed barriers, and they are organized by shape: flat, square, long and narrow, simple, cuboidal, and columnar, and by how many layers there are: simple, stratified, or pseudostratified, and how many of them, some of them, have special functions and will produce secretions like digestive juices or mucus. And epithelial tissue makes glands, exocrine, which goes out, and endocrine, which goes into your bloodstream. And we looked at the different categories here. Then we started talking about the final type of connective tissue, which is connective tissue, and we know that it has living cells in a non-living matrix. That's what they all have in common, even though there's many different types. We learned about the different classifications: circulating, generalized, and structural. We talked about circulating being types of connective tissue with a liquid matrix, that being blood and lymph. A lot of people don't think of blood as a tissue, but it is. And we started talking about generalized connective tissue, which we know generally supports and protects structures. And we learned about loose generalized connective tissue, which is areolar and adipose. And what they both have in common is that their matrix is soft. So areolar is where you have living cells in like jello. The matrix is kind of like jello or gelatin-like. This is your most common type of connective tissue, and it's found in lots of places. It's found underneath your skin, it's found between the muscles, it's found around blood vessels, it's found around organs, it's found in membranes. It's in a lot of places. So adipose is fat tissue and fat cells, and fat is good for long-term energy storage or reserves. It's really good at heat insulation, and it's really good at adding a little layer of protective padding for your organs, which you need because you don't want to damage your organs. There's a nice picture on page 66 that shows circulating connective tissue, and then areolar connective tissue and adipose connective tissue. So I would suggest looking at that. And then, so the other type of generalized connective tissue, besides loose, is dense. And so what can we say? Well, its matrix is more dense. So the matrix has lots of fibers in it, and that makes it not like jello, but makes it firm and strong and also flexible. So what about these fibers? So these are protein fibers, and collagen is the most common fiber found in dense generalized connective tissue. And collagen is a flexible white protein. There are 3 types of dense generalized connective tissue. They are categorized by what type of fiber they have in them and how those fibers are arranged. You don't need to write this down. We'll get into those in the next slide. They are irregular, regular, and elastic. So irregular dense generalized connective tissue is made of mostly collagen fibers, and those fibers are randomly arranged, hence irregular, the term. Where do we find them? They make this fibrous layer surrounding a lot of organs. Like you can find a layer of irregular dense generalized connective tissue around your kidney. And then another type of dense generalized connective tissue is regular dense generalized connective tissue, and it is also made of mostly collagen fibers, but the fibers are regularly arranged, hence the name. And where do we find this? Tendons and ligaments are both regular dense generalized connective tissue. So the last type of dense generalized connective tissue is elastic. So elastic dense generalized connective tissue doesn't have collagen as its main fiber, it has elastic fibers. And elastic fibers are protein fibers, and they're really good at stretching and returning back to their original shape. So where do we want this? Well, places where they stretch and come back, like your vocal cords, your lungs, and then the walls of your blood vessels that need to constrict or dilate. Coming back to this picture, I wanted to point out fibroblasts would be the cells, and then we can see the collagen fibers as part of the matrix and the elastin fibers as part of the matrix. So we've talked about circulating connective tissue and generalized connective tissue, and the third type is structural connective tissue. And this is found in your skeleton, and as you could guess from the name structural, it is strong and solid, and its job is to provide structure. There are two types, cartilage and bone, and we'll get into those on the next slide. This actually is bone tissue, and those are your living cells, and then this is the hard mineral matrix. So let's talk about cartilage first. So cartilage is a type of structural connective tissue. It is a structural material, and it is strong, and it is flexible. Some other functions that it has, it's good at absorbing shock, and it's good at reducing friction between moving parts. Like in your joints, you have cartilage to reduce that friction. You don't want bone on bone. Three types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, and that's going to cover the end of your bones, like the tip of your nose is hyaline cartilage, if you ever want to know what it feels like. There is fibrocartilage, which is more firm and rigid, and that is in between each of your vertebrae. It's flexible and allows your vertebrae to move, but it also needs to be very firm and rigid because you don't want too much movement in your vertebrae. You want to keep that spinal cord safe. And then you have elastic cartilage, which you might guess is more elastic. It's a little more flexible. So that outer part of your ear you can feel is more springy, and that is elastic cartilage. The second type of structural connective tissue is bone. And yep, bone is a type of tissue, and it's a structural material, and it's very strong. So living bone cells are surrounded by a hard mineral matrix. So in these little holes you would have living cells, and then you have this hard mineral matrix making it very strong to make up your skeleton. On page 67 there are some nice pictures of your tendon, which would be regular dense generalized connective tissue, and cartilage, which is a structural connective tissue, and bone, which is again a structural connective tissue. And we will learn more about bones in chapter 7 on the skeletal system. So make sure you can answer these questions. So, what is the general term for the intercellular material in connective tissue? So what surrounds the cells in connective tissue? What protein makes up the main fiber in connective tissue? So what is the most common protein fiber in connective tissue? And 4.5, give some examples of circulating, generalized, and structural connective tissue. Give some examples of circulating, generalized, and structural connective tissue. Now that we've talked about all 4 different types of tissues, I want to talk a little bit about what these tissues can do for us. So one thing is making up membranes. So membranes are special types of tissues. They are thin sheets of tissues that have some important functions. A membrane could cover a surface. It could be a dividing barrier between two different types of tissues. It could be a lining, like in your body or an organ. It could help anchor an organ in place. And then membranes can actually secrete lubricants that helps lubricate joints and also lubricate organs, because you don't want any friction on organs. You don't want any damage to those sensitive organs. Looking at this picture, we have different types of membranes. In the respiratory tract, this young man has mucous membranes, and then some serous membranes surrounding his lungs, and the skin is cutaneous membrane, and then some synovial membranes in the joints. There are two categories of membranes we're going to talk about: epithelial membranes and connective tissue membranes. So an epithelial membrane has an outer layer of epithelial tissue and an inner layer of connective tissue. There are three types of epithelial tissue: serous membranes, mucous membranes, and cutaneous membranes. You don't need to write those down just now, but we will get into them on the next slide. And here's an example of a serous membrane, the pericardial membrane going around your heart that helps protect that. So serous membranes are a type of epithelial membrane, and in serous membranes, one of their functions, their main function, is that they line the walls of a body cavity, and also they surround organs. And it is one big fluid-filled sac that gets folded back on itself. So if you imagine taking a water balloon and putting your hand in it, then it would be like a sac around your hand. It gets folded around itself. And they secrete fluids that helps reduce friction and helps protect those organs. There are three serous membranes. The pleura surround each lung. They're the sac around your lung. The pericardium surrounds the heart and helps protect the heart. And the peritoneum lines your whole abdominal cavity from your diaphragm all the way down to your pelvic floor. So taking a look at this on page 71 is a nice picture of a serous membrane and how it folds in on itself. And then your pericardium, and it goes into, also shows a picture of your pleural space, your pleural membrane, pleura. So page 71, I would recommend looking at that. And then in each serous membrane, we have this outside layer is called the parietal layer, and then the inside that's touching the organ is called the visceral layer. So a second type of epithelial membrane are mucous membranes, and these are going to line tubes and other spaces that are open to the outside. Even though they don't seem like they're open to the outside, they are. So your whole respiratory tract is open to the outside, your whole digestive tract, even your intestines. It's like one continuous tube from your mouth to your anus, so it is open to the outside. So it lines respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive tracts. And you may have guessed it produces mucus. So a hint, OUS is the membrane and US is the stuff itself. The third type is cutaneous membrane, and that would be your skin, which is a very important membrane. So doing some Chapter 4 checkpoints on page 72. What are the three types of epithelial membranes? So make sure you can answer that in class. In our next video, we are going to talk about the other type of membrane, connective tissue membrane. I will see you then. Bye.